On June 2nd and 3rd, 2011, the Center for Design and Geopolitics held its first annual conference in La Jolla at Cal IT2, the California Institute of Telecommunications and Information Technology, on the campus of the University of California at San Diego. So next up is, along with the Invisible Committee, Glenn Black's favorite new media artist, Ricardo Dominguez. We know our friend Mr. Beck launched his new website with Transporter Immigrant tool a while ago now. Ricardo's work goes back a long ways, and there's a lot of ways to describe it. I sort of think of it as a way to, Ricardo's job is to provoke institutions into revealing their own tragic comedic anatomies as they try to make sense of the liminal gestures that Ricardo coaxes them into performing. Sort of like the HAL computer trying to solve some sort of a recursive riddle or pun and thereby feeding back on itself with smoke coming out the sides and so forth. Transporter Immigrant tool in particular, which I'm sure you know about. One way to think of this is a sort of as an experiment in the modeling of the sovereignty, Obama's or otherwise, that is generated directly from or in the image of the interfaces of electronic media, not only as a kind of public space, civis Romanus sum, but also as a kind of public geography, a contested square in the Egyptian sense of the word. So, and for a transporter immigrant tool in this sense, we see how that it both forced borders into a kind of clarified formation, and not only so much as Ricardo as a performance artist, but one which would frame and re-script the entire border patrol, both professional and amateur, into the performance artists that they always were. Ricardo is an associate professor at UCSD in the Visual Arts Department, a Hellman Fellow, principal investigator here in the Bang Lab, co-founder of Electronic Disturbance Theater, a group that developed virtual sit-in technologies in 1998 in solidarity with the Zapatista communities in Chiapas, and his recent Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0 projects, which I've just mentioned with Brett Stahlbaum, who will be moderating the panel, Micah Cardenas, Amy Sarah Carroll, and Elle Merman, is the transporter immigrant tool, what they describe as GPS, a geopoetics system, cell phone safety net tool for crossing the border. So with that, much more, Ricardo Dominguez.
Gracias. Okay, so we have that up. Groovy. Hola a todos, muchas gracias por invitarme. Can I check sound on this? Great, thank you. Bueno, muchas gracias a toda la comunidad. Muchas gracias a Benjamin por invitarme. Thank you so much, everybody, and Benjamin for inviting me. One of the questions that I want to look at right now is the issue of contestational design, poetics of disturbance. And indeed, I'll look at two specific trajectories that Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0 and Bang Lab here at Cal IT2. Bang Lab stands for Bits, Atoms, Neurons, and Genes. But first I'll look at a bit of history as to the practices and methodologies that build into the present moment in terms of this question of contestational gestures. So this is the iconic photograph by Brett Stahlbaum. It's now been shown internationally, where we got the Border Patrol to participate in a performative complex gesture with us. There I am in a utopic, beatific gaze into the future, and obviously the Border Patrol unhappy with what that future might be, ready to capture me. And often with our work, institutions always bring out all the icons of a performative complex of power, and they never catch us. Because in the end, we're sort of like the road runner. beep beeps in the distance of an imaginary, which is much faster than the technology that they can establish that complex in. So as I like to say, we do not move at the speed of technology, we move at the speed of dreams. And here is a nice moment of that. So now I'll go back to my history just briefly. This is Critical Art Ensemble circa 86, 87. It was the cover to our first album, Quit Work. It's the album that really brought us to the foreground. The album was somewhere between speed punk and disco metal. There you see Steve Barnes, Dorian Burr, myself, Hope Kurtz, and Steve Kurtz. And some of you probably know the story about Hope and Steve, who was arrested by Homeland Security around 2007 and accused of bioterrorism for his bio-art work, with the unfortunate passing away of Hope as being one of the reasons that it all played out. But again, Homeland Security lost their case after 4 years. Indeed, when we say it's art, it is art and nothing but art. But most importantly, in order to get to work, you have to quit work. And that was our motto. So one of the important gestures that was important for Critical Art Ensemble was to not fall into the spaces of an odd binary of choosing either apocalypse or utopia, but that is to drive forward a critical recombinant theater, one that could take the measures of power by the simplest gesture. And this kind of echoes perhaps some of the questions of gesture earlier around the post-human that Agamben brings out. The type of gesture that I was particularly interested in was the amalgamation of an Æschylean 5th century gesture and a Brechtian gesture, along with a triangulation of agitprop gesture. So it wasn't about creating an abstract sensibility of a form of life, but more about the simple gesture that it would evoke power to act out its positionalities. So this was a 1987 piece called Exit Culture. It was an analysis of the way public culture has been encased, mauled since probably the beginning of the 20th century. The histories of enclosure are certainly about. And it just made clear to communities in the front of malls or say Daytona Beach or Disney World, that one could participate in the structure of that enclosure. That is, go buy toys, go buy a Burger King hat, buy some cassette music, and instead of being a proper commodity performer and taking it home, I just decided I would take it out there in front of the mall and play with the commodities at hand. It would literally take about 5 seconds for the police to show up and begin to question the rights of an individual to play with the commodities that one had just purchased. It didn't matter where it was. Often it led to interesting conversations with the audience as to, should I be arrested? Was I a deranged homeless person? Perhaps a Vietnam vet suffering from post-traumatic syndrome, and ultimately decisions as to whether I should be arrested or not. An aesthetic confusion would abound. Here I am at Daytona Beach, and if you know Daytona Beach, people drive very fast on the beach. There are carousels, screaming children. Yet you can see that the police officers are disturbed that I would choose a corner of Daytona Beach to play with the commodities I had bought. There again was probably the most interesting occasion in that the community stopped the officers from arresting me and protected me, even though the officers followed me throughout the day. So what this means is that contestational design, shifting the cartography of space and taking the measure of power, you do not need $1 million worth of computing. You do not need the entire squadron of the multitude. You just need a few commodities and a space to use those commodities, to really focus on how power resides and what its positionalities are, and what those liminalities can be evoked along the way. So by the end of the 90s, we brought to the foreground some issues that were important. One was the establishment of the idea of a performative matrix. A performative matrix would be a type of recombinant theater that would emphasize the deep connection between real bodies and data bodies. And again, responding to the cyberpunk movement of especially William Gibson's 1984 Neuromancer, where the term cyberspace is defined, we were interested that his definition wasn't about infrastructure, code, quark code, telephony, connectivity. He defined it as a mass consensual hallucination. So this, again, allowed then one to think that one could, in a very simple way, create a measurement of power in this virtual capitalism that was emerging in a very accelerated way by the 90s, a way to manifest a disturbance that would allow us to then negotiate the aesthetics of what this new power would be. So this performative matrix then in 1991 really came into clarity for me when I read Ronfeldt and Aquila's Cyber War is Coming, and also their Athena Camp essays of 1992. There, they really began to define a large quadrant of how power will begin to magnify itself around the reinforcement of virtual capitalism. And some of the core elements that come into play through Kevin Kelly and other thinkers are the way networks will be defined. That is, as a castle, a bunker to be protected, real estate, something to be sold, the frontier, where new laws, where a cowboy can have his security with him out in the frontier before the cattle barons come, the rhizome, moving almost like a Vietnamese tunnel, popping up in different places, and of course the virus as being another property, all focused around this question of the network. So I thought each of those would create a proper kind of consensual hallucination to begin to play out an important element that came out in the 80s around what issue would disturb aesthetically this new consolidation of the network would be electronic civil disobedience. What it was exactly, we weren't sure, but it would certainly create a sense of connecting data bodies and real bodies and disturbing this evolving virtual capitalism. Here, you had the triumvirate that Ronfeldt and Aquila were dreaming of, cyber war, cyber terrorism, cyber crime, as the manifestation of what the force field and disruptors of virtual capitalism would be. So I chose that perhaps the consensual hallucination that I could interrupt that with would be electronic civil disobedience, but defined through a cyber poetics. As allowing then a shift in the discourse and definition of another layer that it seemed invisible in terms of the way they were defining the defense of virtual capitalism. So that was important in 1991. Also, for me, theater has become an important element, thus why electronic disturbance theater. People always look at electronic, they always look at disturbance, but they never really focus on theater. And I do take that to be a very serious contemplation. And so for me, the Aeschylean tragedy, which is different than the kind of Nietzschean motifs of Euripidean tragedy or the Aristotelian model of Sophoclean tragedy, Aeschylean tragedy was really about defining the process of democracy as it emerged. That is, through a criticality that wasn't driven by the determinations of necessarily of class or kind of affective contagion of Euripidean tragedy. And so I looked at Aeschylean drama as the site of the cyber poetics that would emerge. And here, nomos, the area of law, would be the area that would consolidate the structure of the event. Logos, of course, could be code, if you will, of the virtual republic. Demos, those who demonstrate but have no voice. We get democracy. from that, and of course dromos, those who function under speed politics, dromology, right? So those would be the coordinates of power that would play themselves out in this theater around electronic civil disobedience. Added to that would be an analysis of Jean Genet's theories of minor simulation, especially in the balcony. And Jean Genet defines minor simulation as working between the liminal and the embedded real. And so I thought by bringing and triangulating minor simulation, the liminal and the embedded real, would reinforce the cyber poetics that would bring electronic civil disobedience into that space of disturbance. So it's a long way to get to the actualization. I was lucky enough to create a performative matrix wherein the collaborative code emerged. Brett Stahlbaum, a new media artist, my longtime collaborator, I met him online. I never saw his face for 10 years until I came here. So I thought he was a phantom of the CIA for a long time. And then Carmen Karasik created the FloodNet, the first automated gesture in 1998. One of the important elements about NetArt software is that there are two modes at play. You can see this in Exploit by Galloway and Thacker. That is the aesthetics of disappearance, camouflage gestures versus the kind of ontology of being hyper-present that electronic civil disobedience for us was. That is, our data bodies and our real bodies are coordinated so that when we do a virtual sit-in, you know who we are, we know where we reside, you know our telephone numbers, you can contact us if you have any questions. And of course, people often do contact us as to what is occurring. Here is the original Zapatista FloodNet. We got a lot of good reviews. We were front page many times during that year, but this was the best review. Front page, New York Times, U.S. Defense. If electronic disturbance theater wasn't illegal, it was certainly immoral. So you could see that already this landscape was shifting them from the kind of nomos they wanted to enunciate, cyber war, cyber terrorism, cyber crime, to the immoral, which brings us into the landscape and geoaesthetics of the ethical, where a conversation can occur, whereas it couldn't occur in any other space. Here's from Style magazine, 1999. We were right next to Prince. And the review by John Mackenzie, the most striking thing about electronic disturbance theater is its potential as an unheard of writing machine, literally dispatches from the future. I thought that was nice to be in dialogue with Prince as well. I think it's important for new media art not to be bound to the art page, not to be bound to the architecture page or the technology page, but to be on the front page. That is, in conversation with the issues of the day that are important. Often we're thrown, Cal IT2 in the technology section, what have you, rather than on the front pages. So I came here in 2004, I was asked what I would do at Bang Lab. So I said I would do electronic civil disobedience and hacktivism, border disturbance art, and nanopoetics and nanotoxicology. Those are the three areas that I would focus on. These are the researchers: Brett Stahlbaum, Micah Cardenas, Dr. Amy Sarah Carroll, Ellie Merman, myself. Here we are looking good at Cal IT2. We were on another album cover. So now Amy Carroll is going to give us a little introduction to the transporter immigrant tool.
Did we find him?
No, we didn't find him. He's not here yet.
He's not here yet, Mommy.
Not yet? Will he come later?
Yeah, he would come later.
But not today, huh?
No, not today.
Time's not here yet?
Look at that.
So one of the first things that we did was to take the transporter immigrant tool, which had been building velocity of hyperhysteria, was to find an immigrant that we could cross over with. And so we thought that the spectral entity of Walter Benjamin trying to cross at Port Beau from France into Spain during at the beginning of World War II, we would go there in a type of hauntology and try to capture him in our transporter immigrant tool and bring him to California to meet Adorno. That was his plan. In this process of developing this hauntology, we began to write about certain questions. The transporter immigrant tool is a border disturbance art project that conjures a geoaesthetics meets geoethics gesture against the boundaries which crisscross every single body on the planet, boots up at the nanoscale, interpolating itself into a GPS grid which envelops our planet in its opaque mist. Imagine a geoaesthetics that connects both the human and the inhuman, a geography and ethics. Imagine a geoaesthetics that crosses into and dislocates the fog of geospatial mobility that rallies ethical objects and multiple forms of sustenance. If we live in a world where goods and services a priori have rights to cross borders, where things and proto-things create wireless clouds of data, of access and containment, where a chaosmosis of markets demand aggressive state social filters, we seek, via TBT, to account for performative complexities of the new earths upon which we walk, and those to come, a geoaesthetics that recognizes the cartographies of trans-border bodies with trans-border rights as both a necessity and on the horizon. We set our watches against the disorientation in the service of an artwork to arc a geophilosophy for bodies that already are flowing as trans-borders across the continent's arcs. Key practices that fractalize our geoaesthetic include artivism, tactical poetries, hacktivisms, new media theater, border disturbance technologies, augmented realities, queer technologies, transnational feminisms and code, digital zapatismo, intergalactic performance. Please fill in the blanks and voids. The code that you've been seeing on occasion is from Brett Stahlbaum.
所有失踪者的母亲，我尚未找到我所寻找的。子弹划破蓝天，透过播音器播放萨尔瓦多。
This is indeed a geopoetic system. There are two sets of poems, one conceptual and one desert survival. We've had these poems translated into multiple languages, from Latvian to Somali, to Russian, to Chinese. As you know, just recently, people crossing the border out of 500, a large amount of them were Russian, Chinese, Somali, and indigenous communities from Central America. So the tool offers sustenance on multiple levels and multiple languages, effective code and affective sustenance at the same time. This is the tool itself.
ازدحام کردن میلولیدن هجوم هواها.
In Farsi by Eli Mermad. Here, as was mentioned, we were very popular with Glenn Beck. He did several articles. And some people on the left and the center left and the center don't take poetry very seriously. They say, why poetry? Why? But it seems that the hard right is obsessed with poetry. Seems odd for the humanities not to care about poetry or its force. But obviously, poetry is important. In another of the Blaze taglines, it said, poetry dissolves the nation. You imagine that technology is dissolving the nation, forces of war, but poetry. And I don't want you to ever forget that it is poetry that can dissolve the nation. The tool has been presented as posters, billboards in San Francisco with Galeria de la Raza. Now, I wanted to end briefly that, of course, we're very involved in a narrative about this, what Mary Pat Brady calls an aesthetic project between two nations, that is the border. And this aesthetic project is creating a dialogue of gestures historically, since the 70s till now, of border disturbance art. And border disturbance art that everybody participates in. It's two nations establishing these gestures. Recently, just April, in response to the drones, the narcos have started using ultralight aircraft in order to bring drugs here and to bring armament back to the narcos. And so they have some nice contact with the tourist industry in Acapulco and other spaces. So there's a nice connection between terrorism and the tourist industry. So I do feel that if we want to stop the narco engine of invention, we should shut down tourism on the NAFTA scale. Because tourism does lead to ingenious engines like the ultralight aircraft along the way. The final bit is that Brett Stahlbaum and Paula Poole, his partner, and I, on occasion, go out with the NGO Border Stations, Water Stations, Inc., to put water out. And recently we were out there. And I was discussing engineering of the oppressed, science of the oppressed, and discussing different ways that communities that we don't see as being part of the inventive community, of the engineering community, are very much in dialogue, and how so. We were putting water out at the many caches, and we noticed that the Border Patrol has these drag lines that they go through the desert in order to make the desert readable, right? A geoaesthetics of the desert so they can read the movement and flow easily. And so I was saying traditionally one can have sagebrush behind one, cardboard as a way to erase one's movement. And then we noticed that there was this interesting installation out there that we'd never seen before with a jar of water. And we sort of went out there to investigate what it might be. And of course, as soon as you stop, the Border Patrol loves to come by and share information, and they're very good at sharing, which is always amazing. These institutions aren't bunkers. They're porous communities who care, some who don't care. And they told us that one of the things that the trans-border bodies have been doing, immigrants, is shifting the language of the geoaesthetics of the desert. That is, in order to deal with the drag lines, they've developed these highly inexpensive shoes with a simple string that they wear on their feet, and thus are able to overcome the geoaesthetics of the border, right? And so I'm sure at Cal IT2 we could have spent several $100,000 in trying to figure out what solution might be. And here we saw stacks and stacks of people who had made it to the other side of the US, had drunk water, and then moved on, leaving their technology on in order for us to become aware of it and play out. And ultimately, the Border Patrol agent said that his enjoyment was that there was this constant inventio, right? And if we look back at this question of heuretics, that is the science of invention, we often maintain that it is at the hi-fi level that invention plays itself out. And I would say that that is not the way to establish a process of inventio, of how to reestablish a redesigning, re-engineering of the globe. That is, contestational design, poetics of disturbance, is about discovering the most minimal gesture in the most powerful and open way. That is the performative matrix overcoming the performative complex. Muchas gracias.